Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to have you here, friends and colleagues, to Radcliffe Day 2016. And let me just say before I get started that I know it's warm in here, and I invite you to take off your jackets, do whatever it takes to be comfortable. I'm Liz Cohen, Dean of the Radcliffe Institute. As Harvard's Institute for Advanced Study, Radcliffe convenes faculty and students from all of Harvard's schools and audiences from far beyond our gates to share inquiry into the arts, humanities, sciences, and social sciences. That is why I am delighted to welcome so many of you today, both here in Cambridge and online, to join in our annual celebration. I am especially pleased to welcome Drew Faust, Harvard President and founding Dean of the Radcliffe Institute, Provost Alan Garber, and Bill Lee, Senior Fellow of the Harvard Corporation. Along with other members of Harvard's governing boards, the Harvard Alumni Association, the Radcliffe Dean's Advisory Council, the Schlesinger Library Council, the Radcliffe Associates Program, the Anne Radcliffe Society, as well as past members of the Radcliffe College Board of Trustees and Alumni Association. We are very excited to have United States Attorney General Loretta Lynch, class of 1981, Harvard Law School, class of 1984, with us today as well. And of course, we are thrilled to have Janet Yellen, Chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, as our 2016 Radcliffe Medalist. And a special welcome to former Chair of the Fed, Bernanke, and to Harvard Professor of Economics, Greg Mankiw, for helping us pay tribute to our guest of honor. Welcome as well to the very few of you here today hoping to get advance word on what the Fed will do with interest rates at its June meeting. I would like to recognize the reunion classes of 1941, 46, 51, 56, 61, 66, 71, 76, 86, 91, did I forget one? 81, 86, 91, 96, 2001, 2006, 2011, and our newest graduates in the class of 2016. We also welcome former Bunting Fellows, current and former Radcliffe Fellows, and the Harvard undergraduates who so ably serve as our Fellows research partners. Everyone, please join me in congratulating members of the earliest class represented here today, the great class of 1939. All of us gathered under this tent are joined by an even larger audience watching online. To the viewers who have told us that they would be watching in Japan, and to all of you tuning in from afar, my warmest welcome. As we come together on Radcliffe Day, we think of classmates and friends no longer with us. Please join me in a moment of silence to honor their memories. When Elizabeth Cary Agassiz and her colleagues founded Radcliffe College in 1879, they knew that the world needed the best minds, women and men, working together to forge a world of action informed by ideas. This mission continues at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study today. Let me share a few highlights from the year we have just completed. We have enjoyed more than 50 enlightening presentations from Radcliffe Fellows. To name just 3, anthropologist Lawrence Ralph discussed police brutality in Chicago. Choreographer Carol Armitage spoke about creating meaning through movement. And author Michael Pollan delivered an autobiographical talk about his trajectory as a writer. An exhibition of feminist poetry at the Schlesinger Library opened with powerful student readings of their own original poems and the work of acclaimed poets like June Jordan and Adrienne Rich, Radcliffe class of 1951, whose papers grace the Schlesinger's collections. That exhibition, entitled A Language to Hear Myself, is open today and will remain open through June 17th. I hope you will make a point of visiting. Our annual Science Symposium investigated the past, present, and future of DNA, while our annual Gender Conference examined the fascinating and timely topic of language and gender. All year, we collaborated with the Harvard University Native American Program to explore issues related to Native Americans in the US and indigenous peoples worldwide. We organized new research projects, compelling public events, a major conference, performances, and more. An exhibition featuring photographs of Native American women is on display in the Johnson Coolacundis Gallery in Byerly Hall. Please stop by after lunch today. This exhibit is the most recent use of our newly renovated gallery, which we just opened this academic year. We had high hopes that this new space would provide a creative laboratory for experimentation and original expression by a wide circle of artists and scholars. It has fulfilled those hopes from the very first installation by TeamLab, an innovative Japanese collective of computer scientists and artists. Since then, Radcliffe Fellows, including filmmakers and a composer, have shared their work in the gallery. More information and videos of this year's exhibitions and events are on our website. And ambitious plans are underway for next year. We will be holding conferences on subjects ranging from the world's endangered oceans to gender and sports, and from the international refugee crisis to slavery and universities. The Schlesinger Library will continue to diversify its holdings by collecting even more archives of individuals and groups whose stories contribute to a fuller picture of US history. We will hold a panel discussion about the challenges and rewards of collecting the papers of one such group, political conservatives. Our fellowship program will welcome more than 50 new fellows coming here from 6 continents who will pursue an astonishing array of projects, from novels and operas to the history of the civil rights movement to epigenetics and black holes. The support of many of you right here in this tent makes all of these programs possible. We are in the midst of a major capital campaign for Radcliffe's future, expertly chaired by Sid Knopfel and Susan Wallach. More than 6,300 households have made over 17,000 gifts totaling $55 million. We are approaching 80% of our $70 million goal, and I am especially grateful and proud that our donors come from all 13 Harvard schools, 50 states, 23 countries, and every class since 1933. When Elizabeth Cary Agassiz founded Radcliffe, with her vision of the world's best minds leading together, she also had the courage to imagine women at the helm of that world. I think she would be very pleased to see us awarding the Radcliffe Medal today to the individual that CNN and NBC News have called the most powerful woman in the world. She went like that. Janet Yellen was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Her mother was a former teacher. Her father was a family doctor who saw patients at home, a common practice at the time. Many patients were dock workers and their families. These working families made a deep impression on the young Janet because dock work by its nature was vulnerable to economic fluctuation, which meant frequent periods of unemployment. From her earliest memories, she understood that its effects were, in her words, simply terrible on the mental and physical health of workers, on their marriages, and on their children, end quote. The human effects of the labor market and the urge to do something about them would go on to shape Yellen's remarkable career. Growing up, Janet Yellen excelled at everything. As editor-in-chief of the Fort Hamilton High School newspaper, she was charged with the duty of interviewing the senior class valedictorian, which turned out to be a very awkward assignment. As you've guessed, she was the valedictorian. So she interrogated herself. Her first tongue-in-cheek question began with, "I understand that you are a versatile, attractive, talented senior." The real question was, with so much talent in so many areas, which direction would she go? That question was answered in her first semester at Pembroke, which was then the Women's College at Brown University and a sister school to Radcliffe College. In her first economics class, Janet Yellen found her calling. Years later, she explained, "I remember sitting in that class and learning about how there were policy decisions that could have been taken during the Great Depression to alleviate all that human suffering. That was a real aha moment for me. I realized that public policy can and should address these problems." Yellen graduated summa cum laude and went on to earn her PhD in economics from Yale in 1971. She was deeply influenced by her professors there to study how government action can mitigate hardships, especially unemployment, caused by market cycles. Yellen was inspired to undertake scholarship that met the highest intellectual standards and held the potential to improve people's lives. She adhered to that ideal as she embarked on a career that tacked back and forth between academia and public service. After graduating from Yale, Yellen taught economics here at Harvard until she went to work for the Federal Reserve in 1977. One day, she met another economist, George Akerlof, in the Fed cafeteria. They hit it off immediately, married the following year, and took jobs at the London School of Economics. In 1980, the couple moved to California to teach at UC Berkeley. There, they wrote some of their most influential work, both individually and collaboratively. One of their most renowned jointly authored papers analyzed why wages sometimes exceed market minimums. Yellen and Akerlof showed, in contrast to the standard theory, that it may be in an employer's economic interest to pay higher wages because workers labor harder and do better work when they feel valued. Another one of Yellen's and Akerlof's significant findings grew out of a different sort of collaboration, the birth of their son, Robert. The new parents were looking for childcare and thinking about their budget. Yellen remembered vividly, when you hire a nanny, the question you ask yourself is, what's best for my precious child? And do you really want someone who feels that your motive in life is to minimize the amount you spend on your child? That experience taught them that hiring a nanny is not the time to hoard your pennies, no matter what the market dictates. They went on to support this important insight with a wealth of data and rigorous analysis, but their key contribution was to show that you can consult all the models, graphs, and numbers that you want. But unless you take into account both workers' and employers' non-rational motivations, including emotions, you will not be able to predict or explain the labor market. In 1994, Yellen took leave from Berkeley to join the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Upon arrival, she raised eyebrows with a habit that was out of step with other senior managers: eating in the employee cafeteria. By eating there, Yellen learned what staff members were thinking. She also communicated an openness and a transparency that have been hallmarks of her tenure at the Fed. Yellen served on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors until 1997, and then on the White House Council of Economic Advisors under President Bill Clinton from 1997 to 99. She returned to teaching briefly before becoming president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco in 2004. That same year, she published an important paper with Akerlof that offered a robust defense of government action to avoid recession and to offset the effects of economic downturn. Now, scholars love to be timely, but nobody realized how painfully relevant that paper would soon prove to be. As 2004 drew to a close, unemployment rested comfortably between 5 and 5.5%. The stock market ran high, housing market was hot, corporate earnings were climbing. But as Yellen watched it all from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, she started warning of a bubble in the housing market. Hers was a lonely voice, but as we now know, she was right. The worst financial crisis since the Great Depression unleashed its fury in the fall of 2008, and what we now call the Great Recession followed. Unemployment nearly doubled, stocks plummeted, housing prices went into free fall. Soon, nearly 1/3 of homeowners nationwide owed more on their mortgages than their houses were worth. The financial sector was also in big trouble. Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers went under. Other firms were kept alive only by federal bailouts. Credit disappeared. Capital and liquidity ran dangerously low. And so things stood in 2010, the year Yellen became vice chair of the Fed, serving as second in command to then-chair Bernanke. It may be hard to see why anyone would want to take that job in the depths of an economic disaster. But if we think back to the little girl who was so touched by her father's unemployed patience, or to the young woman who decided in her first economics class that government could and should be an effective and trusted force for the public good, then it makes sense that Yellen would roll up her sleeves, determined to aid household recovery and promote renewed economic mobility. Normally, monetary policy's first line of defense would be to lower short-term interest rates, but interest rates were already at or near zero. Facing stormy seas and fiscal headwinds, the Fed had to right the ship with limited access to monetary policy's usual instruments. As chair, Bernanke skillfully guided the Fed away from its customary closed-mouth habits, summed up by the slogan, "Never explain, never excuse," and toward new habits of transparency. Yellen was crucial to fostering this new sense of openness. She led a communications committee with the same refreshing candor that she had brought to lunch in the employee cafeteria. As she put it, "I hope and trust that the days of never explain, never excuse are gone for good." The Fed shored up consumer confidence and prevented the crisis from worsening, but conditions remained challenging as Bernanke's term as chair drew to a close. A woman had never chaired the Fed, but President Barack Obama nominated Yellen. She began her term on February 1st, 2014. With her values, her intellect, and her calm leadership, Yellen steers our economy toward shared prosperity. She replaces the popular Main Street versus Wall Street dichotomy with the claim that Main Street needs a properly regulated Wall Street, just as a healthy Wall Street needs a thriving Main Street. As she has pointed out time and again, a well-supervised financial sector fuels job creation, innovation, and inclusive economic growth. And in turn, households capable of meeting financial goals such as home ownership, retirement, and college savings are better able to boost markets. For Yellen, the key is careful monitoring through capital and liquidity requirements, stress tests for financial institutions, and living wills for firms' orderly dissolution in the event of insolvency. Yellen's leadership was tested last December when, for the first time in over 9 years, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates. Speculation about an increase had circulated for months, and then as now, the topic was fraught, to say the least. Some commentators criticized Yellen for not raising rates soon enough. Other nervous voices warned that raising rates would lead to another downturn. Normally understated publications like the New York Times threw around adjectives like perilous and hazardous. Yellen remained unflappable. When rates rose, markets, the public, and the media all responded calmly, thanks in large measure to her resolute demeanor. The economy is by no means perfect today, but when Yellen addresses the public, the markets usually respond with what USA Today characterizes as a Yellen rally. Through it all, Yellen steadfastly describes her role as Fed chair in terms that are both principled and unpretentious. To quote her, "The job isn't just about fighting inflation or monitoring the financial system. It's about trying to help ordinary households to get back on their feet and about creating a labor market where people can feel secure and work and get ahead." In a few moments, we will have the pleasure of getting to know this extraordinary woman a bit better. Nobody is better suited to help us do so than Professor Greg Mankiw. Professor Mankiw is a Harvard economist and the teacher of one of the college's most heavily subscribed courses, Ec 10. Like Yellen, he maintains one foot in the academic world and the other in the policy world. In his case, he served as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. But before Professor Mankiw's conversation with Chair Yellen, we will have the good fortune of hearing from the single individual who probably has the greatest insight into Yellen's current role, because he is only one of 3 people alive who has also inhabited it. I am speaking of former Fed Chair Bernanke. Bernanke grew up in South Carolina. He grew up in South Carolina, he graduated from Harvard College in 1975, and he earned a PhD in economics at MIT. He taught at Stanford before moving to Princeton in 1985. As much as he enjoyed teaching, after nearly a quarter century of it, Bernanke had begun to wonder, in his own words, what good was economics if it's not used to improve policymaking and therefore make people better off? He has answered his own question with years of public service on President George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, as well as on the Federal Reserve, to which he was appointed by President Bush and reappointed by President Obama. These days, Bernanke is a distinguished fellow in residence at the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy at the Brookings Institution, returning largely to a life of scholarship. I am delighted that we could pull him back into the limelight today to share his reflections on fellow economist and his successor as chair of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen. Please join me again in warmly welcoming Ben Bernanke.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back in Boston, where I spent many years as a student. And I got over the Red Sox by 2005 when the Nationals moved to Washington. But so I'm glad to be here on this lovely day. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Janet Yellen, someone from whom I have the greatest admiration, respect, and affection. She's an outstanding policymaker, an outstanding person, and we're lucky to have her leading the Federal Reserve. Of course, my appreciation for Janet is only increased by the fact that we are both members of a small club of current and retired Fed chairs. It's a club that doesn't meet very often. A rare exception to this rule occurred recently in New York City when the four of us, Yellen, Bernanke, Greenspan, and Volcker, were jointly interviewed by Fareed Zakaria. The greatest excitement came in the middle of the interview when Chairman Greenspan suddenly gave out a loud sneeze. I remember thinking that if that had occurred a dozen years earlier, the cable news commentators would have spent hours analyzing what that meant for markets. Janet also showed central banking tendencies kind of early. Dean Cohen talked about the story where she, as editor of the paper, had to interview herself as the valedictorian of the school. She didn't talk about the most relevant comment, though, which was when the editor asked herself if she enjoyed working at the paper, she replied, "No comment." Like a good central banker entrusted with the nation's monetary policy, Janet is also cautious of temperament. There's an economist's maxim that if you never miss an airline flight, then you're spending too much time in airports. Despite this wisdom, Janet reportedly arrives hours in advance of scheduled departure times. I've heard that her crack security team at the Fed continuously remonstrates with her. "Janet, Madam Chair, we have sirens, we have flashing lights. We can skip the security lines." To no avail. Kidding aside, verbal discipline and caution in the face of uncertainty are indeed characteristics of good central bankers. But so are the ability to analyze complex situations and the willingness to take bold action when circumstances demand it. Janet has both these qualities. I will forever be grateful to her for her support and insight that she provided when we served together at the Fed during some very difficult years. In her role as president of the San Francisco Fed, where she gained hands-on experience in supervising banks, and later as vice chair, she was consistently precious, as the dean described, about the peril that an imploding financial system posed for the economy, as well as about the risk that the economic recovery that followed could be very slow and protracted. Throughout the crisis and its aftermath, her famously precise and logical analyses were frequently critical for clarifying the situation and, equally important, for persuading others about the need for action. I recall how often when in the meetings of the Federal Open Market Committee, which makes monetary policy, when it came Janet's turn to talk, how everyone would go very silent because everyone wanted to hear the entire argument. And when it did come time for action, as ultimately it always did, she was a forceful advocate of doing whatever it takes, to coin a phrase, to protect our economy and in particular to put Americans back to work. She was a terrific colleague and an invaluable ally. Of course, now Janet is at the leadership role in the Fed, where she's continuing her outstanding work. When it became apparent in 2013 that she was a leading candidate for the position, she came to talk to me in my office about whether she should take the job if offered. Now, we both knew that there could be no doubt about her qualifications for the position. In her multiple previous roles at the Fed, as an economist, as a board member, as a Reserve Bank president, and finally as vice chair, as well as in her lifetime of study of monetary and macroeconomic issues, Janet probably had more direct relevant experience than any other previous chair. Nevertheless, as I talked to her about the job, I wasn't entirely encouraging. "It's a tough job," I said, "and it can be pretty thankless." Well, Janet recognized those difficulties, I think, very, very honestly, and she understood the stress that the position would put on her and on her family, but she, of course, ultimately agreed to serve. It seemed to me at the time that she had several motivations for accepting the president's offer to be nominated, including her lifelong commitment to using what she had learned as an economist to improve the lives of average people. But I perceived that she was also thinking about the historic significance of being the first woman in this prominent post. I think Janet well understood that by taking this position and applying her considerable talents, she could provide a valuable role model for future generations of young women who might otherwise not engage with economics or economic policymaking. That is in itself a great contribution on top of all the others that she has made. Again, let me join the Dean in honoring Janet. I'm very pleased and honored myself to have been asked to join this ceremony. She's an extraordinary individual and certainly well-deserving of the day's recognition. What I'd like to do now is ask Janet and Greg Mankiw, who is a Harvard Professor of Economics, of course, and also a longtime friend and colleague of mine, to come up to the podium. Janet, Greg.
Thanks for those wonderful remarks.
Well, welcome back to Harvard.
Thank you.
It's a great delight and honor to be talking with you. Ben said that central banking is a thankless job. So let me begin by thanking you for all that you do and have done for this country. Now, I thought I'd start off with a little bit of biography. I've been an economist for many years, and in all those years, I've never met a 5-year-old who comes up to me and says, when I grow up, I want to be an economist. But some of them do grow up and become economists, and so there's always some moment where they say, aha, this is a career for me. So at what point in your life did you say, aha, I think I'm going to be an economist, and why?
Okay, let me answer that, but I'd first like to express my great gratitude to Dean Cohen and to Ben for their wonderful remarks. I'm really touched and honored by this award, and Ben is a good friend and colleague, and let me just say that America owes him an enormous debt of gratitude.
Okay, so when did you decide to become an economist?
So, as Dean Cohen mentioned in her introduction, I became hooked on economics when I took Econ 1 or Econ 10 here. And I think in part I'd always been interested in math, always enjoyed math, and I saw economics as a field that uses math and uses quantitative techniques, but for an important social purpose. And that is advancing human welfare and understanding problems that keep people from fulfilling their lives. So it was the social welfare implications of economics plus the analytic rigor that it involves was a combination that appeals to me. Also, in my first macroeconomics class, I studied the Great Depression and business cycles more generally. It was my first exposure really to Keynesian economics, to the general theory. And I think I came to appreciate that although I don't think anyone's ever invented a better economic system than capitalism, and it works very well for a large number of purposes, it is capable of breakdowns periodically in which one has mass unemployment. The Great Depression, the Great Recession, fortunately not nearly so serious, but nevertheless a very difficult episode. And I saw that monetary and fiscal policy were tools that could be used to address unemployment and improve people's lives. And that attracted me, and it's continued to be my motivation.
Well, as a teacher of principles of economics here at Harvard, I'm actually great to hear that that course can be so transformative in such important lives. Now, you mentioned Keynesian economics. I want to talk about your own intellectual pedigree. When you went to Yale as a grad student, you studied with James Tobin. And just to give you know this, but just to give the audience a little bit of background, James Tobin was one of the great macroeconomists of the 20th century, Nobel Prize winner. He studied here at Harvard under Alvin Hansen, who was one of the early Keynesian economists. He's one of the first people in the United States to take Keynes very seriously and bring a lot of the ideas of the general theory to the United States. So you can see that intellectual trajectory from Keynes to Hansen to Tobin to you. And actually, I learned at lunch today that you taught Alan Garber
I did.
macroeconomics. So you can see it continues to today. Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Tobin and how that worked?
Well, I went to Yale, and I chose Yale as a place to get my PhD because I was so impressed by Tobin. I took his course in monetary economics. I served as his teaching assistant in the core graduate macro class. He was certainly an important mentor to me and a friend. And later on, when I went to serve at the Federal Reserve and at the Council of Economic Advisors, he would visit me in Washington and give me the benefit of his policy advice. But Tobin to me was more than just a teacher. He was really an inspiration. And what inspired me so about Tobin was that he had a passion for social justice and a moral compass that pointed straight north. And to him, sometimes economists are accused of working on highly mathematical models that the applicability of them is questionable. For Tobin, that was never the case. Economics was always important because the policy applications of it had the potential to make people's lives better. As you indicated, he studied here at Harvard, read the general theory shortly after it was published, lived through the Depression, saw not only the horrific economic toll it took on our nation, but also the political and social repercussions of that for many, many years. And he was determined to make sure that our country never suffered through such a situation again when there were policy tools that could be deployed. And that was exactly the focus that I've had throughout my career.
Yeah, I have noticed, by the way, as a macroeconomist, that recessions do have one positive byproduct, is they tend to generate a lot of macroeconomists. So the Great Depression generated a whole generation, including Tobin's generation. I went to grad school during the '82 recession. A lot of people were interested in macro. And this recent recession, the financial crisis, has got a lot of people interested in macroeconomics again. So there's one little upside to economic downturns. Okay, so let's think about the evolution of economic thought. I mean, so if you think about what you learned, how the economy works as a student, both at Brown and at Yale, and what we know today, what do we know today that we think is really fundamental, important, that they didn't know back when you were a student?
Well, macroeconomics as a field, I think, has absolutely continued to advance. And Dean Cohen, in her remarks, talked about what I'll refer to as the microeconomic foundations of macroeconomics. This is something that not only did I work on, but Greg, you've made important contributions to as well.
Thank you.
Macroeconomic theory, I think, was criticized that wage and price stickiness or rigidity played an important role in understanding unemployment, but the economic foundations, the micro foundations for why are wages and prices sticky, hadn't been well understood. And I think we've really made a lot of progress in advancing that. And, Greg, as you mentioned, when there is a financial crisis or a period of high unemployment, it does stimulate people to think about macroeconomics and to take off in new directions. And I think that's happened since this financial crisis. And in particular, I would point to a growing body of work that's at the border of finance theory and macroeconomics that's really helping us understand the nature of systemic risk, the way in which it can arise and propagate itself, what to look for as we monitor the economy. Obviously, we don't want to have another financial crisis. We want to do everything in our power to spot developments that could produce a financial crisis. And I think this work is going to help us understand that. But I would say that you asked me about Tobin's work and what's new and changed. But I would say Tobin's work continues to have great relevance to the problems we face today. So as Ben well remembers, it was December 2008, we had lowered our overnight short-term interest rate to 0. Unemployment was still high and looked like it could linger for many, many years, and we were searching for new things that we could do to get the economy going. And one of the things that we ended up doing, and other central banks have as well, was engaging in large-scale purchases of longer-term assets. In our case, long-term treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. And the theory of that was in part that by removing these long-term assets from the portfolio of the public, we would put downward pressure on longer-term interest rates at a time when there was no more to be accomplished in the short end. And really, a lot of Tobin's work on portfolio choice and portfolio modeling, trying to understand what determined the relative rates of return on different financial assets, how demand and supply mattered to that, was in effect the intellectual foundations for those policies and comparable ones that are being used in other parts of the world.
It's maybe apocryphal, but it's allegedly an old Chinese curse that says, may you live in interesting times. And that certainly applies to central bankers, and you've lived in very interesting times. Looking back over the past decade, we've experienced a tremendous financial crisis, a fear that that crisis would turn into a Great Depression, which it did not. It turned into a Great Recession. Right? Unemployment reached 10%, but not the 25% that we saw in the 1930s. So it sort of wasn't great news, but it wasn't as bad as it might have been. So looking back at your time at the Fed, in the Federal Reserve System, not just your current job, what did the Fed do right and what did it do wrong?
Well, I think the Fed's handling of the financial crisis once it was upon us was nothing short of magnificent, and the credit here goes to Ben. He was the right person with the right intellectual background and the courage to think outside the box. He saw in the height of the financial crisis, credit just drying up in the economy, something that would end up crippling businesses and households and could have ended us up in another great recession. And the immediate problem that he and we in the Fed more generally faced was how to get credit flowing back into the economy to avoid that kind of outcome. And although the Fed tends to be a slow-moving and pretty conservative institution, Ben encouraged blue sky thinking. And he tasked everybody around him with being as inventive, as innovative as they possibly could to come up with programs. Some of them might work, some of them might not, might be rejected, might not work, but to throw everything we had at it to try to keep credit flowing to the American economy. We invented a whole bunch of programs with an alphabet of mnemonics that I won't recall all of them for you, but I think that really stemmed what was a very deep and severe financial crisis. And then after that, the programs that we adopted, asset purchases and forward guidance, have made a difference and gotten the economy back on its feet. So, I think those are things that the Fed can feel very proud of. Ben was immensely courageous in doing this in the face of a great deal of criticism, and it was a huge contribution.
I agree with you completely that Ben's an absolute hero of this era. But just push you just a little bit on that. Is there anything you look back and say, I wish we had done that particular thing differently? For example, I wish we had saved Lehman.
Well, I will say that we didn't see the financial crisis coming. Dean Cohen mentioned my prescience, which I thank you for that, and seeing the house price bubble, which I did, and I think others did as well. But I don't think we saw, and this is true of other regulators, and frankly, it's true of economists generally and the private sector, none of us saw, well, we saw trees. The house price overvaluation or bubble was a tree. There was growing leverage in the shadow banking sector. Some people saw that, but putting it all together, how this would come together, create systemic risk, erupt into a very severe financial crisis, the role of derivatives, how they fit into that, we really didn't see that coming. And so, and in that sense, I would say we're really trying now to do a better job of that. It's a high
that
priority.
exactly brings me to my next question, because financial regulation is obviously an important part of what the Fed does and the federal government more generally does, not just the Fed. Are we doing a better job of financial regulation today than we did before the financial crisis?
Absolutely. I mean, the short answer is definitely yes. And the starting point for why we're doing a better job is that we're focused on systemic risk, we're focused on financial stability, and wanting to spot emerging conditions that could potentially result in another financial crisis. And I think we have a better understanding of how to look for those conditions, and we're putting a lot of resources and intellectual effort into doing just that. We now have an entire division of financial stability at the Fed. With respect to our supervision of the banking system, really the most important thing is we're bringing a new mindset to how we supervise the largest and most systemic firms, that instead of taking a trees sort of approach, is this institution individually looks safe and sound, we're thinking about the interconnections among these firms and their connections with other parts of the financial system. This is sometimes called a macroprudential approach rather than a microprudential approach. Beyond that, in terms of regulating the financial sector and making the banking system safer and sounder, I think we've accomplished a lot. The amount of capital in the banking system, and this is particularly true for the largest and most systemic firms, has increased enormously. The quality of that capital is greatly improved. The amount of liquidity that we're requiring large banking organizations to hold is greatly increased. And with greater liquidity, there are less chance that if one firm encounters stress, that will end up mushrooming into a liquidity shortage for the system as a whole in a financial crisis. We're also putting a great deal of work into thinking how to resolve a systemic firm if one were to fail or encounter serious losses without its imposing costs on the taxpayer, the so-called too big to fail problem. We've forced firms to produce living wills that would show how they could be safely dismantled using tools at our disposal. And we're working very closely with foreign regulators, particularly in England and in Europe, to handle tricky cross-border issues and making sure that we're all prepared. So I do think things have improved enormously.
Okay. Well, let's turn to sort of current economic conditions. We've been in a recovery stage for a while, but it's been kind of a slow recovery by historical standards. How do you think the economy is doing right now?
So it has been a slow recovery, but we've made a great deal of progress. The unemployment rate peaked at over 10%, and it's down to 5% now. Just over the last year, we've created around 2.7 million new jobs, over 14 million since the lowest point for employment. And more generally, the labor market on almost any metric that you could use to evaluate it is really improved. Labor force participation has moved up some over the last year, which is an encouraging development because in a society that's aging, with more retirees. There is a persistent downward negative trend in labor force participation. So people who became discouraged about finding work have moved back into the labor force. So I definitely think we've made a lot of progress. But that said, I think further gains are possible. So we're close to an unemployment rate that I think most economists would associate with our full employment goal. But the number of individuals working part-time who would like to have full-time jobs is unusually high, and we've really not seen much improvement in wage growth, which is suggestive of some slack in the labor market. Now, while the labor market's improved, a notable and less positive development is that the growth of output has been remarkably slow, something like 2% on average over the last several years. And when you have a lot of jobs being created in the face of not much output growth, unfortunately, that means that productivity growth, which is the growth in output per worker, is very slow. Over the last 5 years, productivity growth has averaged only 0.5% per year. And that's a really very miserable pace in historical context. Since productivity growth ultimately determines the pace of improvement in living standards for society as a whole, that's a serious and negative development. Finally, I would say with respect to inflation, that inflation for a number of years now has been running below the Fed's 2% objective. This last year, our measure of inflation that we look at is increased only 0.8%. But very important reasons for the shortfall are, first of all, the plunge we have seen in oil prices, and second of all, a marked depreciation of the dollar that's pushed down import prices. Those factors seem like they're roughly stabilizing at this point, and my own expectation is that although inflation is lower than our objective, if we continue to see stability there and an improving labor market, that inflation will move back up over the next couple of years to our 2% objective.
I've been told that a bunch of money managers in New York have delayed their trip to the Hamptons this afternoon so they could listen to your talk here today in case it moves markets. So this is your chance to move markets. Do you want to tell us anything about the path of monetary policy in the next going forward? You're welcome to say no. And if you do say no, then they can now leave for the Hamptons.
Well, let me say a few sentences so I won't delay them very long. So the economy is continuing to improve. We saw weak growth in the first quarter of the year and relatively weak growth at the end of last year. Growth looks to be picking up from the various data that we monitor. And if that continues, and if the labor market continues to improve, and I expect those things will occur, we'll continue to monitor incoming data, and also we'll assess risks to the outlook. But it's appropriate, and I've said this in the past, I think for the Fed to gradually and cautiously increase our overnight interest rate over time, and probably in the coming months, such a move would be appropriate.
Great. You can go to the Hamptons now.
That's it.
Okay, now, one of the interesting challenges that the Fed's faced recently is the zero lower bound. In fact, interest has basically gone to rock bottom. They've stayed there. And some rules of thumb, like the Taylor rule, would have suggested deeply negative rates. Now, we're not in a situation now where it's a big concern, but people are worried. I know Doug Emmendorf raised this issue at this morning's panel, that if we have another recessionary shock in the future, that the Feds won't have many tools left. how much does that worry you? What do you imagine doing if in that sort of scenario? Do you imagine going with negative interest rates that some European countries have been trying? How do you think about that?
So let me agree with what Doug said this morning. It is a concern. We have very limited scope at this point to use our traditional technique, namely lowering overnight interest rates, to support the economy if there is an adverse shock. Even if we go for some time without an adverse shock, and even if you take a reasonably optimistic scenario, participants in the FOMC are asked to write down every 3 months what they regard as a normal, longer-run level of short-term interest rates. And so this is something that they might expect to prevail, say, 5 to 7 years from now, so quite a ways down the road. They write down a number now like 3 or 3.25% is the median. So even if we were to go for a number of years without encountering an adverse shock, and the short-term rates got back to that level, that's lower than a lower level of rates than we've seen historically. We don't even know for sure that the level of normal or neutral rates will rise that high. And in the typical, I think Doug mentioned this morning, in a typical recession, when the Fed wants to respond, we would cut short-term interest rates by maybe 400 or 500 basis points. So we don't have that scope. Now, we did invent other tools to address stimulating the economy. We use these longer-term asset purchases, and we tried to shape market expectations about the path of short-term interest rates through our communications and so-called forward guidance. I think we would resort to those tools again. Negative interest rates is something we considered briefly. We were concerned at the time that there could be a number of negative repercussions from lowering negative interest rates, from lowering interest rates to zero or negative territory. And so we didn't really pursue that, and it's not something that we're really thinking a great deal about now, although other countries have used it. But this is a concern. One of the reasons I believe it's important for us to be cautious in raising interest rates is precisely because if we were to raise interest rates too steeply and we were to trigger a downturn or contribute to a downturn, we have limited scope for responding, and it is an important reason for caution. I would like to see, Doug and others talked about this morning, that there should be greater scope for fiscal policy in the future to be usable to address economic weakness. And if we were to take steps to raise productivity growth, and our panelists talked about a number of important things: education, children, investment in infrastructure, investment in innovation. If we had faster productivity growth, that would probably push up the normal level of interest rates in the economy and give us a bit more scope there as well.
Great. I have one final question. I'm assuming out here in the audience there's some students, and I'm sure there's some students who are looking at you and they're saying, wow, she's had a really cool career. I want to do something like that. What advice would you give that student?
So I think the starting point for me, as I've said and others have commented, was finding a subject I loved and have been able to feel passionate about over all these years of my career, namely economics. And obviously it's not going to be economics for everybody, but finding some field, some interest that you want to get up every day, you want to work on. Obviously a successful career does require hard work, and it's a lot less hard if what you're working on is something you're really interested in. So to me, that's key. I guess I would also say that something that's been important to me, it's not, in thinking about a career, I know I've achieved a remarkable position, but it's not just the end point of one's career that matters. A satisfying career is about what you do all the way, throughout your working years, leading up to wherever it ends. And for me, when I think back on all the stages, I've enjoyed them all. They've all been satisfying, partly because I love economics, but also I'll mention two other things. One thing, I think it's really important to affiliate yourself with organizations that you really feel identified with their mission, that you feel proud that you work for the organization. I've certainly felt that way at the various universities I've been at, and I felt that way very much working in the federal government. Several of our panelists this morning talked about public service, and I will say that some of the finest, smartest, most dedicated, most passionate people that I've worked with have been at the Federal Reserve and in the federal government. And, but throughout, finding people to work with that you brainstorm together, you have to figure out what are we going to do about this problem, and coming into work and having a group of people you feel, these are people I want to hang out with. I feel proud to have these people as my colleague. That's always been important to me. So the people you work with and choosing organizations, you feel, somebody says, where do you work? I work at the Federal Reserve. I feel proud of that. I feel it's an important organization. It's devoted to the well-being of America.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg, for leading us in such a stimulating conversation. I think we've all had a great tutorial today, and it will stick with us, I think, for a long time. And to Chair Yellen, thank you for sharing your time, your experiences, and your wisdom with us today. Now the moment has come to confer upon you the 2016 Radcliffe Medal. She unites scholarship and leadership for the public good. She brings candor and collegiality to solving complex problems. She strives to build an economy in which all Americans can thrive. Chair Janet Yellen, I bestow upon you this Radcliffe Medal with the deepest admiration for a lifetime of visionary and principled service. Thank you.